Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the audio version of my ongoing serial Tales from the Triverse. Today's chapter is called The Professor, Part 5. And Lola Stiles and her rebel friends are attempting to extract Professor Simova, who's currently in the custody of the Brulian City Guard. Tapu, 3203, late frostfall. Reflected starlight was a poor substitute for the real thing, but it was enough for Davila to keep a trickle source running as she darted from one roof to the next. The moon was low, which required her to stay high, to avoid being shadowed by the tight alleys and overhanging craggy buildings of Tapu. Lola and Pilpo were below, making their way as quickly and quietly as they could. Pilpo was an especially nimble Ainfa, and could have easily joined Davila above the streets, but Lola was not really made for such acrobatic feats. Better they stay low, while Davila watched for problems. One such problem emerged from the darkness of a recessed doorway, brandishing a sword that was recognisable from its Brulian design. Leaping high, she channeled the moon's light, and used it to pinpoint the disguised guard's wrist. With a cry, they dropped the sword, then Pilpo was upon them, and a moment later they were disabled. Davila's nerve fleck had been imprecise and clumsy, but it had got the job done. They kept proceeding towards the docks, where Lycasra had followed the supposed representative from the other rebel cell. The contact was more likely affiliated with the Brulian guards. A trap, after all, then, and Lycasra needed warning. It had been foolish to allow Lola to accompany them, but she had insisted, arguing that her friendship with Simova would make the handover easier and faster, giving them an advantage in gaining his trust and extracting faster. Fine in theory, but she was a liability and slowed them down as much as she might smooth the meeting with the professor. There were times when Davila felt more like a bodyguard than a lover. Regardless, they were in it now. The guard had tried to stop them and had certainly delayed them. A flash of light from the docks drew her attention back to the job at hand, and then Lycasra was airborne, lighting up the night with a jet of luminous green plasma. Davila increased her pace. The others would have to keep up. Christian pivoted his blades, shifting on the spot with nervous energy. "Sorry I'm late," he said, glancing up at Lycasra. "Just in time," the Koth said, as usual. A gale of wind from a sweeping of Lycasra's wings extinguished an entire row of the dock torches, plunging the area into gloom. There were perhaps 10 guards in the square, having emerged from the surrounding buildings, but it was the mage that was the problem. Being able to wield was not unusual among the Brulian City Guard, but this one was a physiologist, and a powerful one at that, if they'd been able to momentarily incapacitate Lycasra. Still, they were looking decidedly less confident now that the flames were extinguished, though they still had their wrist-mounted lantern, housed in a protective casing. At the very least, their powers would be diminished, which gave Christian the edge he needed. He launched himself at the mage, knowing that Lycasra would have his back and deal with the other guards. And so it was. Roars of anger from the Koth and squeals of panic from the guards, echoing off the walls behind him, while Christian dashed towards the mage, who stood poised by the water's edge. The mage was fast. Christian was faster still. The mage was conjuring something, preparing a holding spell, the lantern on his wrist flaring, which risked sending Christian to the floor or making him stumble. He'd fought mages like this before. He'd fought a lot of overconfident people like this one. Flicking an arm out, he released the short blade and threw it slicing through the air towards the mage's chest. Instinctively, the mage refocused the holding spell onto the blade, halting it in mid-air. It was the gap Christian needed to close the distance, and he plunged his other blade towards the man's heart. At the last moment the blade was deflected by another warping of air from the mage, embedding itself in his right shoulder. Not a fatal blow, but enough for him to cry out in pain, emotion which he immediately channeled into a new spell that trapped Christian's thrusting arm in place along with the blade. Blood dripped from the wound. He saw the short blade, the one he'd thrown, drop out of the air. "You're a fool," the mage said, as Christian felt an invisible hand grasp him by the throat and begin to squeeze. The mage had him in a 2-point grip, first by his left hand holding the blade and then by the neck. The pressure increased around his throat. He couldn't breathe. "An Ainfa going up against a physiologist," the mage said. "It's a joke. Where's the rest of your crew?" Christian tried to speak, but no air passed his lips. "Didn't quite catch that," the mage said, releasing his grip ever so slightly. The lantern burned brightly in the container, strapped to his left arm. "The question you should be asking," Christian croaked through gritted teeth. "It's what happened to my other blade." A flick of his right foot, upon which he had caught and balanced the weapon, sent it into the air, and his outstretched free hand. In a swift motion he brought the edge of the blade up and through the mage's left arm, just above the lantern. The blade stuck in the bone, but it was enough to break the mage's concentration, at which point all the holds on Christian disintegrated. He brought both hands to the blade together and severed the mage's arm at the elbow, the lantern clattering to the floor. Screaming in disbelief, the mage looked down at his former limb and needlessly bent down to pick it up with his remaining hand. "Shame you can only maintain 2 spells at a time," Christian said. He gave the dismembered forearm a kick, sending it and the lantern over the far edge of the dock and into the swamp waters. Withdrawing his second blade from the stunned mage, he dispatched him quickly and turned to Lakazra. "You've only dealt with half of them," he scolded. "What have you been doing?" Lola climbed up the ladder to the roof of the building next to the warehouse. "Aren't we going to help?" she asked, looking over the edge at Lycazra and Christian fighting in the square. She was feeling exceedingly out of her depth without a lifeguard in sight. "They can handle it," Darla said. "We had specific instructions." Pilpo nodded. "It's our job to get Samova, no matter what." They clambered across to the warehouse and a skylight. "This should get us inside," Darla said. "Hopefully we can spot any guards and take them out before they even know we're here." She concentrated on the lock of the skylight, but the mechanism was too difficult to discern in the darkness. "Let me have a look," Pilpo said, pulling 2 oddly shaped tools from her belt. A few clicks and twists later and the skylight was open. "Sometimes you have to go back to basics," Pilpo said, winking in Lola's direction. "Quietly now," Darla said, creeping inside. Watching where she was stepping, Lola entered the warehouse, balancing on a wooden beam above the storage area below. The warehouse emptied out directly into the river, one half of it a wet space into which a boat could be moored and loaded. Tapping her shoulder, Darla pointed towards the far end, near the large double doors that led out onto the river. In a corner, bound on a chair, was Professor Simova. Darla gestured in the other direction towards the main doors to the square outside, where 2 armed guards could be seen waiting to surprise anyone entering. She nodded to Pilpo, who started nimbly clambering over the roof supports towards the guards. Taking her arm, Darla moved with Lola the opposite way, towards Simova. More guards were visible below. Darla halted and made sure Lola was paying attention to her. She pointed first at Lola, then at Simova. Darla then indicated herself and pointed down at the warehouse floor. She raised her thumbs and waited for a response. Swallowing, Lola returned the gesture, a knot of tension in her belly. Moving over the rafters, she headed towards the river exit and Simova. Behind her, she heard a cry as Darla dropped silently onto a guard. Sounds of fighting filled the space, and Lola moved faster, desperate to accomplish her part of the mission. She couldn't fight, not really, but she could free Simova and get him out while the guards were distracted. Finding a ladder, she started to climb down, only to feel a hand grab her foot and slam her to the floor, landing heavily. Something cracked in her shoulder. She looked up at her attacker just in time to see it was Gina, a face partially hidden behind a lower mask, but still identifiable by those bright eyes. Gina simultaneously realized Lola was her target and, at the last second, altered the path of her ice lance to impact harmlessly into the warehouse floor. "I told you to leave." Her eyes burned with fury, her fingertips still frosted from the spell. "We're not your enemy," cried Lola, shuffling backwards towards the ramp that led down to the water. "I'm not your enemy. You're being used." "Bullshit," Gina said. "I told you what he did." She gestured towards Simova, who was bound and gagged, his eyes bulging as he looked between the 2 of them with fright and confusion. "How many of you are here? There's a dozen guards outside, more in here. Is Simova that dangerous? That important?" It's what Darla had pointed out. "Do you normally send this many people after a pervy university lecturer?" There was hesitation in Gina's face, and her posture slackened somewhat. "I follow orders." "Whose orders? Captain Rexon's?" Another pause. From higher up, then, was at the university. "Chancellor Baltine?" "I've seen the files," Gina said, "and you have no proof. Let us take Simova. Come with us. I'll show you. You just have to trust me." Gina's mouth fell open, and she blinked repeatedly, seemingly trying to speak. Words tumbled out incoherently, A rivulet of blood flowed from one nostril. "Don't have time for this," Darragh said, approaching, one arm outstretched. "Pilpo?" "On it!" The Ainfar ran past, darting behind Samova to cut his bonds. "Stop," Lola said, dragging herself to her feet. Darragh ignored her. Gina's arms had flopped to her sides. Her eyes were rolling back in their sockets. "What are you doing? Stop, you're killing her." "This has all gone to shit," Darragh said. "We can't leave witnesses." Lola reached out and pulled Gina's mask down. "It's Gina. Stop. Right now." "She's a city guard. She's not your friend, Lola. She would have arrested us all if she could." "It was her that helped us escape from Brulia, remember? Without her I'd be in a cell or dead already." Lola pulled at Darragh's arm without success. She stood between her and Gina, but that did not interrupt the wielder's grip on Gina's brain. Lola curled her hand into a fist and smashed it as hard as possible into Darragh's face. "I said stop." Staggering backwards, caught off guard, Darragh's eyes flared angrily in her direction. "Fine," she said, at last, making a gesture with her hand. "She'll live." Gina collapsed to the floor, unconscious. "If this comes back on us, remember that it was your decision," Darragh said. "Okay with me." Lola returned the stare, unblinking. Pilpo's voice interrupted the moment. "We're good to go." She'd untied Samova and was pulling the gag from his mouth. Lola Stiles?" he said, his voice shaking. "I don't understand what's happening, but thank you. You have to know what I know. It changes everything. It started with Yvette Field. They don't want anyone to know. I have to tell you everything, in case they get to me. We don't have any time." Darragh stepped forward and put a hand on the man's shoulder. It was intended to be a comfort as well as a signal for him to quieten immediately. "We're getting you out of here. You can tell us all about it once we're clear." She looked to Pilpo. "Check the exit." She led them out, walking past Lola without a word. She had no idea how long she'd been out, but Gina could tell she'd taken a clobbering. Her head rang with the most intense headache she could imagine, a brain fog stopping her from thinking straight. Her arms felt heavy, her face oddly rubbery. The warehouse was quiet. She was on her back, staring up at the wooden ceiling. Willing her body to move, she wrestled herself up. As soon as she was on her feet, she doubled over and vomited onto the floor. Wiping her mouth with the back of her sleeve, she forced herself on. Her wrist lantern was broken, she realized, its flame extinguished. Stumbling through the warehouse, gripping the walls and wooden railings for support, it wasn't long until she stumbled upon Dan and Ainley in crumpled heaps, lifeless eyes staring up. By the door were Tulsa and Konyu, dead, deep gashes in their chests and scratches on their faces. Pushing open the door was an almighty effort, and she staggered out into the village square. All was dark, the moon having already begun its descent, ready for morning. Bodies lay scattered around the dock, some torn into multiple pieces, such that she couldn't identify them. Limbs, torsos, parts of heads. The squad leader, Sergeant Wolfe, lay near the water, missing an arm. He'd been a good man and one of the more accomplished physiologists she'd ever met. Had treated his comrades well. He'd always been fair. There was nobody left. She was the only one remaining, alone in a village hundreds of miles from home. A terrifying storm had blown through, leaving a trail of death. Her friends were gone. Thanks for listening. You can find a lot more and leave comments and all that over on the newsletter version at simonkjones.substack.com.